This episode is on the second half of national culture in the United States and the movements that were trying to reform society. So there was a big impetus to reform, to make things better. The 19th century was very famous for the intellectual community and those who were in leadership believing that they were going to inevitably make everything better in their world, and that was in the Western world in general, but in the United States as well. So we saw in the United States several utopian movements. We see a religious awakening, and we also see an economic effort at an economist or industrialist try to build an communal utopia as well. So these things are extraordinary people that are trying to do things that are a little bit extraordinary, but they represent the cutting edge, or the edge of how people were thinking in the age. They were very optimistic about things. So here we have a period of reform and some of the reform efforts. The first thing you want to notice, and this one's a little bit more broad, so while I'm going to look later at the utopian movements that are exceptional and extreme and representative then of the general sort of thought, this was a broad-based second Great Awakening. You should remember that we had a first Great Awakening in the 18th century, in the 1730s and 40s in the colonies. This is a early 19th century second Great Awakening, when there was a mass movement to religious sects and new religious sects that came to light and attracted a broad following. So I'm going to talk about these religious sects broadly and some of the features of them. First off, they would have these preachers would come out and they would have large camp meetings. And a camp meeting meant they went out in the field and they encouraged and got a lot of followers, and they had a religious service out in the field, and they called it a camp meeting because they would stay for a few days usually in these reawakenings or Great Awakening camp meetings. They also considered it a harvest of souls. So they were trying to attract people who were not Christian, and they wanted to convert them to Christianity and so save their eternal souls. And that's why they called it a harvest of souls, that there were lots of people who still were not Christian and needed to be saved. So they harvested those souls that had yet to be saved. So they were for new adherents largely. They rejected skeptical rationalism, so they rejected much about the Enlightenment that had inspired the founders of the United States like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and they were much more interested in their spirituality. So the Enlightenment and rationalism and that dominance of reason in society was neglected by them, and spirituality was emphasized. And they reified some Christian principles, which was that faith alone would save you, and they believed that good works would illustrate your faith in the community. So these new Christian religious sects tended to encourage good works as well as faith, and active piety, which meant that you interacted with God or did work on God's behalf on a daily basis. And so they emphasized active piety to prove really to yourself that you were faithful, that you were a follower of a Christian God. This movement attracted women and other people on the outside, and lots of African Americans were also attracted to the new religious sects and the new approaches. The two religious sects that had the broadest attraction and following in this period and they were relatively new in the sense that they had been around for maybe 100 to 150 years, were the Baptists and the Methodist sects. religious sects. And they also had agendas that attracted people, and that was, one, to stop alcoholism in communities and among families. So these sermons often railed against the use of alcohol and encouraged the abstinence on the part of people. They also railed against slavery as an agenda. So this would also be the beginning of the abolitionist movement, or at least one of the inspirations for the abolitionist movement. And then two, they also tried to defend and improve the conditions for women who were subject to all males in their world. And oftentimes it would really depend upon whether your father, husband, brother, etc. was a nice guy to you or not, right? So sometimes women ended up subject to men that were less than nice. And they really encouraged women to some extent to take an active role in their own life and in their own conditions. So this Great Awakening really, in short, had a profound impact on abolitionism and on women's suffrage, as well also alcoholism. So it's an odd combination of anti-Enlightenment yet modern individualism for many people. Now let's look quickly at some of the utopian movements. And remember, these don't affect a broad part of the population, but they illustrate the optimism and the extremes to which people would go for reform and improving and follow the whole scent of progress in their lives. So one of the most well-known of the utopian movements is actually a religious movement, and that was the formation of Mormons and Mormonism. They were led initially by a man named Joseph Smith, who found a book, or had a book that he called the Book of Mormon. It is believed by Mormons to be the sacred writing of prophets who were in the Americas between about 2000 and 200 BC. So that's what the Book of Mormon is, believed to be by Mormons themselves. So prophets, early American prophets. One of the things that the Mormons did that made them outsiders and rejected by the community was to practice polygamy. So men had many wives, and this was highly distrusted by the more mainstream, I guess I would say, community. And it also got Joseph Smith into trouble. So he was eventually murdered. He and his brother actually were murdered by the community in Illinois. So Mormonism started in Illinois, and its leader was eventually murdered, and the leadership of the Mormon community was taken over by Brigham Young. And on the right-hand side you have a picture of Brigham Young. Brigham Young's distinction is twofold: that he took over the Mormon community, and that he led the Mormon community on one of the biggest migrations, collective migrations in all American history, if we're not looking over a whole period of time, but just a single group of people. He would take Mormons from Illinois to Salt Lake, and the migration included almost 10,000 people. So it was a huge migration. They were going to set up a theocracy where the community, where the society, where the religion and the state were one and the same. So the Mormon leaders of the society were also the religious leaders. So in Salt Lake they set up a theocracy. Alright, so that's the beginning of the Mormonism, and it is part of an era of reform and utopian inspirations, right? So let's look at another utopian movement, the Shaker community. It too has religious origins. They believed that God was in everyone, and they would get together in communal religious services or communal congregations and sit. And when God inspired you, you got up and talked and or made talked or sometimes said things that were not articulate words, but just gibberish. And oftentimes, when they were moved by God, they shook, and that's why they were called the Shakers. But they believed that God was in everyone, literally. A little bit different from the Transcendentalists, but the line between the two is kind of vague. They also believed that that marriage and a sexual union or sexual relationship detracted from their worship of God. So they advocated for celibacy and social equality, so everyone was equal in the Shaker community. All right, another utopian movement, and this one is in the region of Massachusetts, was led by Joseph Humphrey Noyes, and it is called the Oneida Community. The Oneida Community had two things about it. One was that it was an independent religious sect, but also that they made silver and metal objects, right? So they were the producers of pewter and metal and silver. And today we still have a Oneida company because of that produces silverware and those types of things. But this community was believed that you could perfect yourself, and that the goal of every individual was to perfect yourself, and the community was intended to help you in that direction. So they considered themselves, and they called themselves perfectionists, but that meant that not only did you try to be better, but also that the community was intended to criticize you. So they had a process by which they practiced what they called mutual criticism. And they would put somebody in the middle of the group, and then everybody would tell them what was wrong with them. And then that was intended that you could correct yourself ultimately in the end. They called that mutual criticism, and it sounds pretty harsh. They also had a notion of complex marriage, which got Joseph Noyes in trouble. So not only did Joseph Smith get in trouble, but also John Noyes. And this complex marriage meant that they didn't want to have the competition between people and couples over coupling. And so they thought that you were married to everyone in the community, and they raised children communally, so that there was no competition between people over partnerships. Right? And that was their notion of complex marriage. It's basically communal, and the community arrested Noyes for adultery. So even in Massachusetts, they didn't accept anything but female-male marriage, one man, one woman marriage, and anything beyond that was not just out of the expectation, but also against the law. So he was arrested for adultery, and they let him go, and Oneida obviously continued. They then believed in communal parenting. So when a child was born, it was born to everybody in the community. So there you have it. That's another utopian movement, the Oneida movement, and they hope to make people's lives a lot better. All right, last is an economic utopia, and that was built by Robert Owen, who was from England, in fact, but he wanted to go into the United States, where everybody thought they could start their own little communities. And, you know, the whole John Winthrop's city on a hill concept. But Robert Owen thought, oh, I can go buy some land in Indiana, Harmony, Indiana, it was called, and I will build a whole communal, economic communal society. So it's the first effort at a communist society, and it is built in New Harmony, Indiana, and it was intended to be everybody contributed work and everybody benefited equally from the profits made in the New Harmony, Indiana. So it was cooperative labor and equal compensation for that labor. So there was no private property either, so everybody owned everything as well. And this immediately had problems. So Robert Owen's New Harmony socialist experiment lasted for about 6 years, and we can call it social engineering, but it's socialist experiment. And it lasted 6 years, and that was about the end of it. People, essentially what happened was people some were working really hard and others weren't, and they started to decide that, wait, there shouldn't be equal compensation if I'm doing all the work. All right, so those were all the utopian movements. The Mormons, which obviously took and last till today. The Oneida, which the company still is in existence today, but the community's gone. And we still have a few Shaker and Shaker communities as well. And those were religious, and then finally New Harmony, Indiana, and economic community. Now, on a broader scale, the state and the society were making some inroads into reform. And that's the last thing I want to look at in this age of reform. So we really do have a age in which they're changing things because they think they can make people better, they think they can make society better, they think they can improve faith and religion. So there really is this movement towards improvement. Right? They will change. There's a lot of theory out there and discussion and movement to not have prisons where you're assumed to have a nature unchanging and flawed, and so therefore should be punished, to a penitentiary. So American prisons now come to be called penitentiaries, where people who have flawed natures or are sinful can come, do their time, and the idea is that they will repent for their sins and build a new self, and then re-enter society as a new penitent, right? So we call them correctional institutions. The prisons came to be called penitentiaries because of that. And that is a 19th century phenomenon. Mental illness was now looked on as not a permanent flaw, but as an illness. So people were seen, if you've got some sort of psychological issues, then they started to say, well, it's not just your nature, and put them into asylums, but that there's an illness and that maybe we can do something to correct it, something to treat the illness. And so Dorothea Dix led this effort to consider psychological disabilities as mental illnesses that could be treated by medicine or therapy. The temperance movement was also a big movement. Temperance means that you want to reduce or end the consumption of alcohol, and that the word temperance comes from a Christian notion that you are to keep yourself away from things that make you bad or evil. Right? Temper your emotional makeup, right? Or your excesses, I should say. Right? So the temperance movement was a Christian movement against alcohol and alcoholism. They said and made arguments that alcohol made people immoral. So the temperance movement saw itself as a moral movement to increase the morality, improve the morality of people by not allowing them to be weakened by the evil spirits of alcohol, if I can speak in their words. So they made an moral argument, and they also made a material argument. The material argument went like this: alcohol destroyed the family because, and with all due respect to men, they said men went out, got drunk, and two things could happen with drinking. They would go home and be cruel to their families, or they would continue to drink and gamble at the same time and lose the needed money for their families. So they caused financial and physical distress on their families from drinking alcohol. And that was their material argument. So those were the two arguments made by temperance movements and why they wanted to stop alcohol and alcoholism. They finally, in the 1920s, get their way for a short period of time. But that is History 12. We also see the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. So the Second Great Awakening and this Age of Reform are kind of linked up because the women's suffrage movement, suffrage means they want the vote, comes to the fore at this point. It was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and these women would get out and they actually have meetings that they bring women to, and they write a Declaration of the Rights of Women, which is all about women should have rights and the vote, right? They should have their rights protected by the government as individuals, so not be subject to the men in their world. And the big convention that they have where they write the Declaration of the Rights of Women is at Seneca Falls in 1851, actually. So this is kind of a broad age of reform of the whole early 19th century. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the big leader of the early women's suffrage movement in the early 19th century, and it really fell in once again with this new age of reform where Americans and the West are very optimistic that they can absolutely change the conditions of humanity to get better and better and better, actually. And the 19th century had that optimism. All right, so, here you are, Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And that's the end of my discussion of the popular aspects of the Age of Reform and some of the extraordinary aspects of the Age of Reform in those utopian movements.